My name's Mary Riley. For those of you that don't know me, I work for MSU Extension with the Government and Public Policy Group, also known as the Community and Government Vitality Group. I can't keep all the names straight. I service Northwest Michigan and actually really most of the western lower peninsula. And I live in Ludington and I'm based in Manistee. And previously, in a past life, I was a zoning and building director for many years for a county. And so I bring kind of that lens of understanding that there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of gray areas, and I have a great deal of respect for anyone who serves on a planning commission or, you know, in that capacity for their community. We also have, I know, a lot of different viewpoints here tonight, which is great. And hopefully we'll have time for questions for solar. I've carved out a more intentional chunk of time for the Right to Farm Act and the GAMS presentation. And Ryan Coffey Hogue will be joining us for that Q&A portion of the Right to Farm Act. I am required to wear the mask. If I pass out though, I'm taking it off. It's part of our requirement for MSU Extension. So tonight we will be starting off with solar, and much of this presentation is based on a new document that we're expecting. We've been working really hard on it. It's a sample zoning document for solar energy. We've partnered with University of Michigan on this, and it should be coming out probably sometime, I'm thinking by the end of next week. It's in the final polishing, editing stages right now. And so Trudy took your emails as part of this registration. So you will be getting that document relatively soon. And I think you'll be able to see like, oh yeah, I saw that, or okay, I get that. So I'm kind of just warming you up for some of the basic components of that document. So I want to acknowledge my colleagues, Brad Newman and Harmony Gamazel, who also helped author this, as well as Sarah Mills from University of Michigan, Charles Gould, who brings a lot of information about the agricultural side of solar, and then we also had Wayne B.A. and other students helping with the document. So we're going to cover some background on solar, and then work through scales, and then planning and zoning. So a while ago, it wasn't that long ago, solar didn't seem like it was very, like it just wasn't going to happen. And we're in a very different place now with both the technology, the economics of solar. Things have really changed in the last 10 years. But typically the elephant in the room is, gosh, we're in Michigan, it's kind of gray. You know, do we really have enough solar here? The answer is yes, we do. We are similar to, you know, parts of Europe, Germany, for example. Germany is a world leader in solar. And so you don't need to be the Sahara Desert to, you know, really have a viable solar resource. So within the United States, you know, we're still, you know, we're not great, but we have enough. You look for that over 3.5 kilowatt hours per day, and we're definitely in the 4-ish zone. So we have that viable resource. And if we didn't have winter, winter is really our difficult, our issue, right? In Michigan, our summer months, our June, July, and August are really, oops, I don't want that. Just trying to get rid of that thing. Uh-oh. Oh, what happened? Oh, geez. I was doing so good. What did I do? Trudy, you'll need to stop it. Sorry, everyone. It had this live stream thing and I didn't want to do it. be back on shortly. Okay, she has to let me in. Yeah, can you let me in?
All right.
Excellent. Got it. Ooh, oh, sorry. I have to mute quickly. Okay. All right. What would a night be without a little technical hiccup? So yeah, I want to emphasize that, you know, the solar resource is not ideal, and in that context, I mean, we're not Arizona, we're not California. However, when sited properly, it is a sufficient resource for electricity most of the year. We do have those gray winter months, so the solar numbers appear as an average. If you saw our monthly ratings, our June, July, August, you know, actually it's like May through September, May through October are really quite good. It's our January and February numbers are not so good. And the cost has come down significantly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is accessory photovoltaics for, say, like on a roof system on a home. And so in 2010, that's the far left column. The cost was $7.53 per, I think it's per kilowatt hour, and now it's down to $2.71. And commercial, same thing. The story is it's gone down significantly. Now for utility scale, it's gone down even more, from $4.75 down to under $1 for these kilowatt hours. And so that's why I said the economics are changing. The resource is viable, the technology is improving all the time as well. So solar is coming. In Michigan alone, I just updated these numbers, and I was surprised, but we installed quite a bit of solar just last year, which increased our rank. I think we were 28th and now we're 25th. We had 590 megawatts of installed solar just last year. And our percentage of our state's electricity from solar, it was 30.30, so it's less than 1%, but it went up to 45% in just 1 year. So it's significant. And then the same thing with the homes. I was so shocked when I was typing these numbers because it was like 48,000 homes and now it's 93,000 homes. And so these numbers are significant. But we did get a head start on wind. The wind as a renewable started a little bit stronger and a little bit earlier. And so we have the 2,681 megawatts of installed wind versus the 590 megawatts of solar. So about 5-to-1 right now, wind to solar. However, the Consumers Energy, DTE are both planning significant increases in renewable energy. So that yellow you see on the graph is planned solar expansion. And they are retiring a lot of their coal generated plants. And so as those come offline, solar is coming online. So without question, it's being planned and it's coming to Michigan, more of it. It's already coming. And so we used to have something called net metering. Now we have distributed generation where the homeowner can put, solar on on their house, and then the meter, your electricity use is offset by your solar panels. And for some time, there was some legal questions about that consumers energy had in particular that has since been settled. But you can see the number of those distributed generation customers too are increasing very rapidly. And again, that's partially because that cost per unit of energy is coming down so significantly. So there are some caps on this distributed generation, how much the utilities will allow in total. So that's a bigger policy issue, and it's a concern for many, but that is yet to be it's something that's sort of on the horizon. So in terms of our overall state, solar readiness, in 2019, the MDARD amended their PA 116, which is a tax savings for farmers. If they put their land into PA 116, they receive some tax savings there. But it was amended to allow for solar under certain conditions. So that opened up some of our agricultural lands that previously did not allow for solar. And the economics continue to improve. The tax structure for both, for distributed generation as well as long-term taxation for solar farms, if you will, there's still some questions at play, and I know there's committees working very hard to get some of that tax policy squared away. And in terms of planning and zoning, we are just kind of in our infancy, it seems like. The University of Michigan did a study on all of the zoning ordinances in the state in 2019 and found that only 33% of Michigan communities had zoning regulations for solar, and only 20% of those addressed large-scale solar. So we know it's coming, but yet we're not we're not quite there yet. So that's part of the reason why we came together and are doing a sample zoning for solar, because it can be quite tricky, as I will talk about here. One of you could say it's really awesome and interesting, right? That solar can occur in any landscape. From the most natural national park, might choose to automate a well or put it on their visitor center, to very urban, to the most dense urban cores, solar can fit somewhere. So whenever you're thinking about solar, you have to think about how it's broadly applied and can be across all zones and maybe all zoning districts in some context. So we're going to walk through that, but that's what made doing this document and thinking about density and scale especially challenging when it comes to solar. So kind of translating that to thinking about that transect, that's what's called the rural to urban transect. We kind of did a pictorial analysis of what solar might look like in those transects. And so, on the far left, I think that's a National Park Visitor Center, and the natural, I think I have I don't, but, here. And then the rural landscape, you can have a pretty large installation that offsets a farmer's costs. You could have a standalone, but relatively small, 3, 5, 10 acre type of principal use, or you could have, they go up to very large acreages, 800, 1,000 acres installations. This one right here is a carport at MSU. And our team was really excited about this carport idea because Michigan's really good at parking lots, unfortunately, right? But thinking about a dual use for some of those large parking lots, Walmart, Meijer, the mall, what have you. But thinking about carports on those marginal lands, not always the farmland, not always the rural. But so thinking of it in all these different contexts, rooftop, light posts. This is at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. They have a a solar installation there in terms of like an institutional setting. So it's helpful to think about it in lots of different contexts. On the left, we're going to revisit that, the roof-mounted, ground-mounted, small, and large. That's a kind of cornerstone part of the document, thinking of those uses. And you might have seen this SES acronym that stands for Solar Energy System. So thinking about the system holistically, not only the panels, but the racking, the batteries, the inverters, any kind of wiring. Typically that's underground. Especially in Michigan, we've seen mostly underground, but in some places the wiring can be above ground as well. So I will be kind of referring to maybe some of these features, but you'll see the SES acronym very common. So I just wanted you to know that that's the whole system. And we're going to run through just a bunch of pictures so again, you can get a sense for some of these basic concepts. The accessory use solar is obviously accessory to the main use. So these would be the rooftop system, the ground-mounted system that supports, you know, a building or a garden, that kind of thing. Here's some more examples. And then you have your principal use. That is where that solar is the primary use of the property. And that tends to be what these larger utility scale systems are, is treated as a principal use. And the inverter system, I will be talking about the inverters, that's that white box, but they also appear as, oops, these little boxes, see underneath the solar racking. Inverters can be that way too. But solar is silent other than the inverters. They can create a hum. And so I'll speak to that. And here's a couple of examples of larger systems in Michigan. The Lapeer is 267 acres development, and the Detroit O'Shea Park is much smaller. It's only about 10 acres, but it's right in urban, you know, relatively an urban area. Detroit is kind of an exception though, because it has some open lands in it, even though it is an urban area. So it's a little bit atypical, but that's why we extended the urban large scale even into the urban landscape because of the uniqueness of Detroit. Now I want to point out that I talked about marginal lands, but the city of Coldwater installed a solar system on a brownfield where that ground could not be disturbed. And so solar can also be on a ballasted system. You see those concrete blocks there underneath, and so you're not digging into the ground and disturbing. So again, that's another example of solar applied on a marginal land. And this is just rule of thumb because we're all interested in, you know, planning and zoning, right? So when we speak about megawatts, 1 megawatt of solar is typically 5 to 8 acres is the land that would take up. There is some variability based on what's going on the property, if it's being farmed, if it's being used for other things, if there's unique natural features, if there's, you know, what are the setbacks that are required by the district. So we're trying to account for some flexibility there. And as the systems get larger, obviously, the land that is required is larger as well. So that 100 megawatt system, typically 500 to 1,000 acres, but there's a lot of variability. Again, it just depends on the design. But it is more land intensive than wind energy, right? The footprint is a little bit larger. And what's also fun about solar is this dual use idea, where solar can be it can allow for multiple uses. So you can have, solar in pollinator habitat or agriculture, but you can also have solar in the parking lot, solar in school grounds, solar in the right of way. We're not ready. We haven't done that yet, solar in the right of way, but it's possible. Brownfields, community gardens. And so as planners too, it's interesting to think about all these ways that solar can exist in a duality type of situation. So before we get to zoning, we got to talk about planning. So we all know the worst position to be in is a solar developer comes in with a big proposal. It's kind of exciting, but you have nothing on the books, right? What are we going to do? We have nothing, right? We don't have any regulations. So then you're kind of in this hurry to, come up with something, and you're looking at other ordinances and what can we copy paste? And it's just a really ugly situation. So we really want to encourage folks to think about planning first, getting some kind of rational ordinance that comes out of that planning. And I want to show you a few examples. Huron County is one of them, but renewable energy, in the past, it hasn't really been a part of that visioning that we think about. Michiganders have been pretty passive about energy planning because it's DTE or consumers will make energy or cherry land, and it's not really here, or in our backyard. It's been kind of something that happens far away. And so communities need to kind of think about that, renewable energy in maybe a way that they haven't in the past, and then start including that in their vision so that it can filter through some of those goals and objectives. So I'm going to go through two examples pictorially, if you just bear with me, but they're Kittitas County, Washington, and Acme Township, Michigan. And they both use mapping, but they use these different, they're slightly different standards to try to wrap their heads around where would solar work in our community. And so one was based on distance to substation. Solar does, larger installations anyway, typically are within 3 miles to a substation. A developer will look for that because it costs a lot of money and you lose some energy the farther away you get from the solar generation. Slopes, and then not in prime farm agricultural zoning. And we'll talk more about that. And Acme Township used sun exposure during the winter months. They also used different landscape types, sensitive lands that they identified, and then also farmland. Some farmland too is under conservation easement, and some of those conservation easements, the owner will definitely have to check how solar fits into that, or it does not fit into that. But there are other types of programs that restrict development based on a taxation agreement. So those are other things to think about. So pictorially, so this is Acme Township. So on the left is that winter solstice. The middle is the sensitive lands, and then they looked at an overall suitability by combining some of those things together to determine where solar was suitable. And then they have some hatched properties there, which are under conservation easement, and so those would not be allowed for solar. Because within the zoning model, we're kind of stuck with, well, should we put it in ag, right? You want to open up the whole district to that? Does that make sense? So maybe that might be perfectly fine. But other communities are looking at it in a different way. So here's in the Washington example, they applied those 3 standards, slope, distance from substation, and prime farmlands, and came up with tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 1 meets all the criteria, so those they determined were more prime areas for solar. So mapping can be a really powerful tool to help the townships kind of think through solar suitability in maybe a different way. There's other tools. I'm not an expert with these, but this EasyM tool, EasyMT, is kind of a powerful mapping tool that integrates GIS, which has substations in it. And it has solar resource information, but it's not super fine-tuned. But it has some great GIS resources. And then this PV watts, you can put in your address, which is great. And it runs you through some different power output scenarios and that kind of thing. And that can be really helpful, powerful tool for a homeowner. Likely, you know, if they're working with a solar contractor as well, they'll be talking through all those details. Finally, another example, Huron County. Huron County was a pioneer in wind energy and has a lot of installed wind energy. So for their upcoming master plan, they took more of a deep dive into renewables. They asked the community, what kind of renewable energy do you support? And so they had hydro and geothermal and others on this list, but I just highlighted these. But solar was the most well accepted of the renewable energies. And from that, they developed specific renewable energy goals and an action plan for directing regulation to certain areas. So these are just ideas of how renewable energy, how you can start planning for renewable energy. Of course, thinking about those marginal lands first, brownfields, landfills, parking lots, highway, right-of-way. MDOT's not there yet, but airports are another area where solar is being more often applied. And within PA 116, there's certain elements that are required if solar is on those properties. And so field tile is one example, keeping a cover crop that's planted. That includes pollinator habitat. And then a surety bond is also required for removal. So it's kind of interesting thinking about solar, because either it could be removed at some point, or it could be re-energized with new technology at some point. And so the time horizon is kind of interesting. And the PA 116 sort of recognizes that, in that it wants to prepare for the end of solar, but at the same time, it wants to keep cover crop. It wants to keep the soils healthy, so the land can be returned back to agriculture. But maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll just be, the system will be repowered and it'll go another 25 years. Again, these dual use, just some examples. These are more in the agricultural context. We're definitely moving away from either solar or agriculture, really trying to see ways that those can be combined or exist. That's what we're calling dual use. So foraging, I just took this picture, or I took a picture like it. I was down in Cassopolis in the Southwest Michigan, and there was some sheep, grazing. That's popular. I did take that picture. This next one is Rob Davies. Pollinator habitat can be installed in and around solar, which could help surrounding crops be more productive. Agrivoltaics is actually planting crops alongside solar, kind of at the same time. So there's harvesting and that kind of thing going on. And then simple conservation cover, no-till, planting things that are good for the soil, that sequester carbon, all of these things, rather than just your turf and gravel, what you might see in some solar installations. And so for this document, you'll hear this dual use agrivoltaics, and it is being required for the large scale systems, but not the small. And again, along this dual use, when we're talking about pollinator habitat, MSU Extension or Michigan State University has come up with a pollinator scorecard. And so there are ways to test, right? And for for developers to be really clear on what kind of plantings they need to do, and in what mix and what seeds and all of that kind of thing. The science has really come a long way on that. So the local community is not not having to legislate that kind of a specific mix of seeds, for example. So we really want folks to think about solar and agriculture holistically. And because we see sometimes that prime farmlands are an automatic disqualifier for solar. And that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. Especially when sometimes in agricultural zones, you're allowing large lot zoning, you're allowing an airport, you're allowing golf course, other land uses that also take up acreage, right? And so you have to think, and we might allow that without even giving consideration to the soil type. And so somehow with solar has gotten like, we can't do it on prime farmland soils, but sometimes it's the only land use there is that gets that treatment, right? So we're not saying that that's necessarily wrong, but we want you to think about it holistically. If you're only singling out solar just because of that, then that you have to question that, right? Why not other land uses as well? But if you have a broader agricultural protection scheme or ag preservation board, you have an active purchase of development rights program, you have a lot of those other things in place, then you definitely would be wanting to have the conversation about, how does solar fit in, where does solar fit in with our stated goals. And I know Leelanau County certainly is active, right, with, these agricultural preservation pieces. And so, maybe it is okay to not allow them on certain soils, but we want to encourage you to think of it holistically and not single out only solar with that standard. And I think I just talked about all of this stuff. Yeah, I did. Got ahead of myself. So a lot of times when the application comes, right, you're like, do we have enough in our plan and can we just do the zoning, right? Who's been there? Can we just skip the planning part? So we know it's a reality, but we want you to kind of reconsider and think about how you could use the planning to really acknowledge some of the data, the analysis that I showed, the mapping, and thinking about those broad agricultural questions. You can have really great public engagement and work groups, study groups, rather than just kind of going to that public hearing model that's synonymous with a zoning amendment. All right, so these are all the kinds of things, where the substations, slopes, sensitive areas, PA 116 properties. What scale is optimal for us? That's a really big question. How big is too big? How small is a size that we wouldn't really mind? It wouldn't be that big of a deal. 5 acres, 10 acres, that it could be done with just site plan approval. Finding those trigger points and scales is sometimes easier done in the planning process than just with the zoning process. That looks a little like Steve Patmore right there, doesn't it? All right. Any questions?
Why was he banging his head on the wall?
Any questions so far? Yeah.
Were you suggesting, I'm sorry, were you suggesting that if somebody wants to put a resident, panels on the top of the roof, that this should be part of the zoning process and that there should be regulations regarding what they can and cannot put on?
I'm going to get to that shortly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So but it has in your chart that this is part of the plan. And I'm curious why there should be such a thing if someone decides they want to go with the utility.
Right, yeah, so the plan, I think the plan would probably speak more to the small scale, but not rooftop or ground mounted systems.
All right, could you define small scale?
I will coming up.
Okay.
Are we limited? Can the power company limit how much solar you can have on your property?
Typically, under the distributed generation, you cannot produce more than what you use.
In other words, they don't buy it back anymore.
You can't be a net generator of solar. You can produce what you use, typically. We have a solar expert in the room. Am I saying that right?
Not an expert, but I would correct your statement a little bit. You also have to be very careful which utility you're referring to.
Yes, thank you.
With Cherryland, for instance, up to the consumption of your residents, you get a higher rate of return. Once you exceed that consumption, it drops in half.
Okay, thank you.
And the formula is very slight.
Yeah,
So
so depends on the utility.
what you're basically saying is they've set up a system, the utility companies have set up a system that if someone like Tesla came in and put up power walls to people who had their own solar system and then tried to sell to Tesla, which Tesla's trying to set up such a system right now, where Tesla would become a power company, that the utility companies have already taken care of that. Make sure that can't happen.
So you're competing with.
So in other words, if I put it, I have a system right now, 11.4 kilowatt system, and it doesn't generate enough, it generates about 60% annually of our electricity because we own electric house. But that being said, if we wanted to add to the system or make it more efficient, and put in a power wall, a battery system, we could theoretically take in more than we actually use. But you're saying the utility companies have prevented that.
I don't know that, I'm not an expert in that, the economics of the home systems. So that's a question for I would say a contractor or installer. They can help you through the economics and your utility company, frankly. Yeah.
A utility company is basically saying, we have a 10-year agreement at the end. 10 years, you will either sell to me at our lowest rate or we will cut you off. And that's consumers.
Okay, yeah.
And that's their plan, and no one's been able to change it yet. And you want to tell me how that is promoting sustainability in the state of Michigan?
Yeah, there's more than, well, consumers and DTE are even different in and of themselves, have different policies, and since Cherryland is different from them. So a lot comes down to that, yeah.
You hear the term solar farms all the time. Why wouldn't solar energy be considered an agricultural product? No different than anything else we generate from the soil, from the sun. It all is contributing to those crops. And I guess if you could think in that terms, if that's an agricultural product, then maybe, what we're leading into next, Right to Farm, would help that. And so I guess I think from an agricultural producer all my life, this would be a product that you could grow, and why wouldn't you, if it has value, why can't I sell that to anybody I want as I do what I generate today?
Right. Well,
I guess,
having lived through the wind energy issue up close and personal, that argument was made, many times. But renewable energy is not covered, or energy generation is not covered under the Michigan Right to Farm Act. It is regulated separately.
How would you initiate that?
Well, you probably have to work closely with the Michigan Public Service Commission and get through all of that.
It's probably not popular to the
No.
big guy.
No, it's not. And even that's the distributed generation questions, right? It's all about economics and how much the grid can bear, and how, because they're used to, these coal plants or natural gas plants with a lot of control. And so we know with renewables, right, you're going to have peaks and valleys. So part of the argument is, how do we stabilize the grid? How, we can't go to a completely decentralized system where everyone's selling their own power, because we still need a stable grid, energy on the grid.
Just seems like it would be an alternative to the stable, in my eyes.
Yeah. Interesting point. Incidentally, too, a common question is, so if we have a solar or wind energy farm here, Leelanau County, do we get lower energy bills, or somehow do we get to keep the energy here? And the answer is no. We're part of a what's called MISO, this large 13-state conglomerate of energy production and use and demand. And so it's really fascinating to go to the MISO website and kind of look at all the power sources and what's going up and all the prices and all of it. So it's a rapidly fluctuating system, and they keep close track on like next day energy forecasts, so that they can figure out where all this power is going to go. So pretty fascinating stuff. All right, so we're going to get into the zoning bits. And I hope you don't all go to sleep. I hope some of you love zoning. But this is one of the trickier elements of solar, right? Is zoning, because of the very small to the very large. You can have a solar calculator, a solar watch, a solar lamp, a solar landscape feature, all the way up to this utility scale system. So you really have to think broadly about this. So the way this document is set up, and by the way, Trudy's going to email it to you. You know that. So from the left, it's rural to urban. And then from top to bottom, we have our roof mounted, accessory ground mounted, that principal use, large use. So for those large uses, we are recommending the special land use option, which would allow communities to create certain specific standards and requirements for those larger systems. For the small systems, it's a mix of site plan review, that's SPR, is site plan review, and then special land use in some districts. So that site plan review would mean, if you meet all these standards, your application will be approved. It could either be done administratively through the zoning administrator or through the planning commission, depending on how a zoning ordinance is set up. The Ps are just a permitted use, a use by right. And so that's the $50, the $20 permit, the whatever that the zoning administrator approves. So fairly minimal regulation, but some regulation. Okay? And that's across all of the Transect. So we'll talk more about these. So we're suggesting that the roof mounted systems be included in the general provisions. So the general provisions are in the ordinance that they apply to all districts. And so where you have a roof, it is not a big change to the landscape or the building or the building height to have a flush mounted solar energy system right on the roof. Should there need to be height, we're going to have a lot of fill in the blanks in this ordinance, or pick your own adventure. So there's no way that a community can copy paste. They have to have to fill in their metrics that they're comfortable with. And so for that height above the roof, we're suggesting, 5 to 10 feet. And, some historic structures may offer some, sensitive points. If you're in a historic preservation district, for example, you might have some additional requirements about not altering the character. But even in solar, historic buildings, they are starting to incorporate solar. And also, we're advising that solar not be considered an expansion. If it's a non-conforming building, the solar not be considered as an expansion of the non-conformity that would trigger a variance or some other type of more complex procedure. So for ground-mounted systems, again, this is our accessory ground-mounted. So buy a house, buy a commercial building, also just a permitted use. Again, the height, we suggested 20 feet here. You could have something less. The 20 feet is somewhat driven by an agriculture, thinking about the solar panels starting 8 feet above the ground. If you were grazing cattle, for example, you'd need that height. And you'd also need much stronger poles because they tend to rub up against the poles. Or let's say you're farming, we're not quite there yet in terms of crop farming or row farming, but thinking about machinery, wanting to get in or under or around to harvest under solar. So that's kind of where that 20 foot is coming from. But if a community might decide that's too tall, they'd be more comfortable with something less, let's say 12 feet. Setbacks, minimum of X, feet, and thinking about, if that's not possible, then half of the required setback for whatever the setbacks are for accessory structures in the district. So giving solar just a little more latitude, given that it's silent and doesn't move and not a lot of issues with it. All right, so further ground mounted, we're suggesting that they're located in the side or rear yard. So they're not in the front yard, but in the side or the rear yard. And if for some reason the side or rear yard doesn't work for you, that you've got tons of trees, you're well and septic, I don't know what, or your waterfront, maybe you've got the lake back there and you don't want your solar panels in the back, that we're offering some administrative options to have it in the front yard, if that's what would be the most beneficial in terms of the resource and your property. We didn't want folks to be asking for lots of variances on this issue. If, let's say, I just can't get the sun in my backyard, there's my neighbors have trees, what have you. We wanted the option to locate it in the front yard. And then there's building integrated solar energy systems. So that's when the panels themselves are the roof, or the wall is the solar panel. The solar is built right into the building components. So when that is the case, there's no additional permitting for solar. Whatever regulations apply to the building, apply to the building. So there is that interesting new set of solar. So the large and small, we're suggesting a 2 megawatt or somewhere between 5 to 20 acres, but 20 acres would be the top end of that. But 2 megawatts is a threshold in terms of power purchase agreements for the utilities. And so it tends to be something like 2 megawatts and less, or much larger than that. But the thinking about the small is that it's something that it's a scale for your community that you would think that it's a permitted use. You would allow it as a permitted use with site plan approval. So if that's whatever scale that is, if it's 5 acres or 10 or 20 or in that range, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 80, is small. It really depends on where you are in the state and your comfort level with that, or the community's comfort level. But these would be important distinctions. For small principal use, we are suggesting that any perennial ground cover is okay. The reason for that is we're starting to see more of these smaller systems on school grounds, institutional situations, where they absolutely could do a conservation cover or something like that, but sometimes they already have turf and they're mowing in and amongst the school grounds, or say a park or something like that, where it just doesn't necessarily make sense to require this other kind of pollinators or conservation cover. The fencing is an interesting issue too, and that's for both the small and the large. We don't want people to get too caught up in the fencing. The National Electric Code does require a fence, but we've seen barbed wire, 7 foot with barbed wire on one end, and we've seen a split rail wooden fence, or just a 4-foot chain link fence on the other end. And so, you don't want the fence to be the reason why, why it's approved or denied. Some communities we're also seeing maybe a fence opening on the bottom to allow wildlife through, or wildlife fencing with maybe smooth wires or openings in the middle to let different animals through. But like if you're doing sheep herding, for example, you don't want any openings. So there's some variability, but I wouldn't get too restrictive on what kind of fence. Just allowing a fence, but maybe leaving it up to the developer. But if you wanted to not allow barbed wire, for example, you'd be within your rights to do that, for sure. Yeah.
Is there a shock hazard to humans or animals with these ground mounted arrays?
Not that I know of, no.
Okay, so it's not like a swimming pool where you would want to put a fence around it to protect young children from falling in and drowning?
No, certainly not in a on the residential level. You don't see these being fenced. They're just they're in the yard, and it's okay. The larger systems, though, like I said, this is Wolverine Power Company, and there's split rail wooden fence, so it's barely a fence. So there's just a lot of variation there.
That is the rationale for the electrical code, is my understanding, that you casually leave around the groundway is not a problem, but little kids climbing on it and pulling on wires, that could be.
That could be, yeah.
Yeah.
Good point. Okay. So for these larger systems, we are requiring this dual use concept that be implemented. That will help if it is an agricultural property. Again, that will help with the soils, the root structure, the ability to be returned to farming at some point. It just makes a lot of sense.
Do
And
these
so
electric companies buy up the land, lease it, or how does this work?
either they can buy it or lease it, either way.
Okay.
Yep. Many communities are requiring some kind of screening around the installation as well. And so obviously the best thing to do would be to keep any natural screening that's there. But if it's not there, then some rows of deciduous and evergreen trees. And that can be strategic too, along roadsides or buffering residential properties. It doesn't necessarily need to be around the whole thing, but being strategic about buffering. So we've talked a little bit about agricultural protection as well. So maintaining that drainage infrastructure is important. Really thinking about subdividing fields. Sometimes these installations are on several different properties. And so thinking about how you maintain the viability of those agricultural fields where there's still going to be production going on. And then decommissioning or repowering. So this idea of repowering is instead of decommissioning, instead of tearing it down at the end of 20 or 25 years, that the system is allowed to repower. They're allowed to put on new solar panels that might be infinitely more efficient at that point. Maybe they want to put on tracking systems. Most of the systems we have now are what's called fixed systems, but a lot are moving to tracking systems. So they'll track, they'll move as the sun moves. And so that really helps to increase the efficiency. And so at any point during the life of the solar system, we feel that they should be allowed to repower, put in tracking systems, put in more efficient solar panels, because it is a vested right. It is a vested property right. And if you had a house, you could put on a new roof. You could maintain it, right? And really quickly on sound, the sound from some inverters are very quiet. Our team has talked about other inverters that it's hard to have a conversation by. So the goal of the sample zoning is to think about this during the site plan review. So understand the sound modeling, put the inverters, if they do make noise, put them at the center of the development, and so they're the farthest away possible. And then the site plan can produce these ISO lines, which are just like contour lines, but with decibel levels. And so you can very easily predict what the sound level is going to be at the exterior of that development. And this is not like wind energy where, we have to go back and test and all this stuff. We really want folks to get this sorted out in the design stage. And so you'll be done with it at that point, because it is just kind of a humming sound, or, it's a quieter sound generally, but thinking through that in the design stage. So there is a sound element in the ordinance. Glare is one that our team went back and forth on. And the newer solar technology is really designed to absorb as much sunlight as possible. I think in the past, we've all seen some of those glassy looking solar panels from like the 1980s. They're still on a house. But they've come a long ways in terms of avoiding any reflected light, because that's just wasted energy. And so in 2021, the FAA rescinded their ocular analysis for airports. They kind of did a big shift in policy change. They do still require a test done to make sure there's not a glare to the air traffic control tower. But there's no glare in the regulations. You won't find any, you won't see any. However, there is an option to have a glare study should the community want it. So we want to put that out there, give you the option, but solar technology has come a ways in terms of glare. And decommissioning, pretty standard stuff, getting that performance bond and adjusting it for inflation. So when you're getting that sample zoning, again, there's fill in the blank options. We want it to be clear your community can be more restrictive, it can be less restrictive, right? It's just a sample. You don't have to take the ordinance language as it is. You can modify it any way you want. It is just a sample. And so think about basing it on a plan first, or thinking through some of those analyses before you start the zoning. But we're really looking forward to getting that into your hands. So we're going to take a break, but before that, I want to announce Phil is going to be out in the hall, and he's interested in farm stays, the idea of farm stay. Anyway, if anyone's interested in that, and solar person, I forgot your name, I'm sorry.
That's all right. My name is Joe Forbes, and I'm with Leelanau Energy. We're a nonprofit that advocates and educates for renewable energy, and most of that is solar. We also have a display out in the hall, and we'd be happy to chat with anybody that might have an interest. We offer free services for nonprofits.
All right, so enjoy some treats and water and,
If I could just say, there's a survey, my October 5th deadline is being done for Leelanau Township. And so one of the things on there is farm stays. So I'm just a citizen here trying to help explain people, because there wasn't a lot of definition in that. We didn't have a lot of space, they didn't have a lot of space in it. But it's just to help answer people's questions, what they might be.
all right, so they'll be out there. We'll get started about 7:10.